The forest wasn't burning, it was breathing fire. The ridge glowed like a wound across the Yukon sky, and every gust of wind made it bleed brighter. Trees crackled and folded into themselves, their trunks snapping under the heat's invisible hammer. Ash fell in slow spirals, white against a world turned orange. In the shallows of a narrowing river, a grizzly bear stood, June, massive, deliberate, her coat singed at the tips, her breathing short. Behind her, a cub trembled in the mist of steam, fur soaked, eyes wide. His name was Rusty, small against the inferno, yet still alive because she refused any other outcome. Above them, the sky roared as if joining the blaze. Below, the river hissed, an animal of its own, boiling but defiant. Between flame and flood, June held her ground. In that chaos of light and ash, survival itself seemed to take form. Flame met water, and neither surrendered. The river's surface churned with molten reflection, its current carrying tongues of fire that should not exist. Every ripple mirrored destruction, every spark answered by spray. June pressed forward, muscles trembling but sure, feeling the scalding air peel across her back. The heat ate at sound, swallowing the forest's screams until only low thunder remained. Rusty stumbled behind, half submerged, fur spiked with ash and steam. The river wanted to claim him, the fire wanted to erase him, and between them, his mother became a moving wall, breathing, burning, unbroken. Far beyond the smoke, unseen mountains waited, indifferent, holding the memory of older fires and older survivors. Every breath June drew scraped against the inside of her chest, but she kept moving. The wilderness wasn't dying, it was choosing what to keep, and it would keep them if they kept fighting.
The sky had lost color. Everything above the ridge shimmered in the war between light and heat. Rusty could taste metal in the air, that strange flavor of fear turned physical. His small heart drummed rhythm against the ground as he crouched, hiding from nothing and everything. Around him, the smoke shifted like slow creatures, curling and twisting as if thinking. His world was no longer made of trees and wind, it was made of noise and brightness and the heavy smell of burning roots. The river slapped at his paws, boiling and cold all at once. He tried to move, but the mud held him like memory. Then, through the chaos, he saw her, the one constant shape amid dissolving things, his mother. June's silhouette moved through the vapor, a living shadow cut from courage. The wilderness screamed its language of endings, and she answered by standing taller. June placed herself in front of her cub, every instinct reduced to one command: endure. The air was a blade against her skin, cutting without bleeding. The fire didn't move like water, it thought, it hunted. It climbed the valley walls, rolled down slopes, and lunged where life still stood. She felt the heat on her muzzle, saw embers drifting like red snowflakes, landing on her back and dying in her wet fur. The river hissed its protest behind her, white steam rising as if the world were exhaling pain. Rusty pressed against her leg, a heartbeat trembling through fur. June did not flinch. Behind her eyes flickered something ancient, a memory older than her own blood, survival not as choice, but as commandment. For every inch the fire advanced, she gave one back. Between her and the river's hiss, the story of defiance began to write itself in smoke. Across the burning distance, hidden by the low hum of chaos, a human form stood motionless at the boundary. Evan Cole, ranger of the valley, watched through the heat's distortion as the bears fought to stay alive. The wind twisted the scene into something unreal, water on fire, earth glowing, air breaking apart. He couldn't reach them, not now, not through that wall of living flame. Yet even from where he stood, he felt the logic of their struggle. Nothing wanted saving. Everything wanted to survive. His radio crackled, ignored. He lowered his binoculars and stared into the inferno as if the wilderness itself were speaking.
Beyond his feet, the ground shook, heat waves bending the horizon. He saw the mother move again, the cub behind her, two dark shapes against firelight, and for the first time, he understood how the wild defines faith. The wind turned without warning. What had been a steady burn became a stampede. Columns of flame twisted into spirals, feeding on oxygen the size of breaths. Trees bowed and collapsed in rippling waves, sending sparks like shooting stars across the valley floor. June felt the change before she heard it, the deep inhale of a predator made of air. She braced, body angled to shield Rusty as hot gusts rolled off the ridge. Smoke thickened, turning daylight the color of copper coins. Every sound flattened into a roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The river fought back, pushing steam upward in frantic bursts, but even water has limits. Ash collected on Rusty's muzzle like gray snow. The wilderness was rewriting its boundaries in real time. Wind, fire, and current drew new lines of territory, and in the center of that shifting map, two bears still refused to move.
Then, almost mercifully, the noise collapsed. The fire paused to breathe. The air hung heavy, tasting of salt and carbon, and the only movement was the slow drift of embers cooling midair. June stood unmoving, her flank rising and falling under layers of soot. Rusty trembled beside her, the river licking at his paws with faint warmth. The world had gone quiet in that deceptive way storms sometimes do, when the next strike is only catching its breath. The forest's skeleton loomed in black silhouettes against a gray horizon. Even the wind seemed stunned by its own violence. For a moment, the bears existed in a pocket of stillness carved from chaos, each breath measured, each heartbeat amplified. It felt like the ending of something vast, yet beneath that hush lay the whisper of beginning. Nature never stops, it only shifts form. Silence here was just the turn of a page. From that stillness, the smoke began to thin, stretching upward until it bled into cloud. What had been ash turned pale, softer, lighter. The roar faded, replaced by the hiss of something new, snow. It fell through the rising heat like lost feathers, each flake catching firelight and vanishing on contact. The landscape blurred between seasons, the color of endings washing into the color of erasure. June lifted her head toward the cooling sky. Around her, the air carried the faint scent of thawing ice, as though time had folded back on itself. Rusty pressed close, his small body shaking with exhaustion. Snow landed on his ears and melted instantly. The flames retreated into memory, and winter stepped forward without apology. It wasn't mercy, it was sequence. The wilderness had decided to rewrite its temperature, swapping one danger for another, forcing survival to adapt again before the echo of relief could settle.
Before fire, there was ice. Before rescue, there was loss. The mountain had not always glowed. Once it gleamed, frozen, faceted, indifferent. Long before the ash and steam, the valley was a cathedral of silence, where wind carved hymns into stone. Up there, the world owned a single color, white. And on that white, one small shape struggled for definition. Every story begins somewhere different than it ends, and this one began suspended between sky and nothing, where the air is too thin for comfort and the ground is too far to matter. What burns must first freeze. What survives must first fall. The wilderness never tells its tales in order. It loops, it folds, it teaches through repetition. Now the snow completes its disguise, and the world becomes quiet enough to hear the start of the beginning. A cub alone on a ledge, with no witness but the cold. The frame fills with light so sharp it erases depth. Snow drives sideways across a cliff face scraped clean by wind. Below lies a gulf of shadow, miles deep, a place where echoes freeze before returning. On a narrow shelf no wider than a heartbeat, a grizzly cub clings to stone. Rusty's fur, matted with ice, shivers in constant motion. Each gust lifts him slightly,
threatening to pry his small body free. His claws search for purchase in rock, slick with frost. Above, clouds drag their bellies against jagged peaks. Below, the valley breathes slow and distant. The sun is a pale coin behind the storm, offering light without warmth. No mother nearby, no path forward, no scent trail left unburied by snow. The wilderness hums a low, endless note, its reminder that mercy doesn't live here. Against that sound, Rusty holds on, a speck of life challenging geometry itself.
The mountain stood motionless, old and cruel, carved from the bones of time. Wind scoured its face in icy waves, a constant polishing of silence and frost. On one of its narrow ledges, Rusty trembled, a cub no larger than the shadow of the cliffs around him. His paws bled where claws had scraped too long against frozen stone. Breath came as fog that froze before drifting away. Above him, snow blurred the sky into an unbroken sheet of white. Below, nothing but air and the slow churn of a buried river. He had not eaten for days. His stomach made small, hollow sounds the mountain ignored. Everything around him was vast, patient, waiting for him to stop moving. Yet somehow he kept his eyes open, scanning the void for a shape that wasn't there. Hope was no longer a thought. It was simply the refusal to fall asleep. In the valley far below, scent traveled easily, carrying stories of movement and warmth. But up here, scent was erased. The blizzard had scoured every trace of June from the snow, leaving only the sterile taste of cold air and rock dust. Rusty lifted his nose anyway, sniffing for her as instinct dictated, trying to build her presence from memory. The wind answered with indifference. The absence pressed against him harder than the storm itself. He shifted his weight, the ledge complaining beneath his claws. Time stretched into something shapeless. Each heartbeat measured distance, not in miles, but in seconds, stolen from the inevitable. Somewhere deep inside, hunger began to sound like fear. He leaned forward, testing the air again. It smelled of nothing. No trees, no earth, no safety. In that emptiness, he learned what loneliness truly was. The moment when even the world forgets your name.
Below the ledge, the valley slept under its white shroud. Pines bent beneath ice, their branches whispering under the strain. The river, hidden under a sheet of frozen armor, moved like muscle beneath skin. Slow, secret, unending. If one listened closely, one could hear it humming, the sound of persistence beneath silence. Up high, Rusty was a single dot of warmth against the mountain's vast geometry. From that height, the valley looked safe, untouched, a cradle of light far beyond reach. But the calm was deceptive. What seemed still was merely waiting. Predators moved along the tree line, ghost gray against snow. Yet none of them would climb this high. The mountain belonged to emptiness now. Clouds thickened, swallowing horizon lines until the world seemed to vanish around him. What was left was isolation, distilled to its purest form. Just heartbeat, wind, and a ledge too narrow for dreams. It began as a vibration in the snow, a faint tremor, like thunder, turned inward. Rusty's ears twitched, registering a rhythm that didn't belong to nature. Then came the sound itself, deep and uneven, chopping through the wind. Rotor blades. The noise grew, bouncing off cliffs, confusing direction. For the first time in days, something alive approached, something larger than the storm. Snow lifted in spirals around him, drawn into the artificial current. The helicopter appeared through cloud, like a moving wound of metal and light. Its spotlight swept the cliff face, cutting lines across the storm. Rusty squinted, frozen by brightness he didn't understand. The machine hovered, tilting against the wind's temper. Inside, shapes moved, blurred, methodical, distant. A rope began to descend, swinging in wide arcs. The wilderness, long unchallenged, growled through the wind as if warning this intruder. Everything taken must be earned.
Miles away, in a base carved into snow and steel, Evan Cole followed coordinates across a trembling screen. His headset hissed with static and clipped voices. The rescue operation wasn't supposed to include weather like this. Outside the small window, the storm pressed its gray face against the glass, trying to get in. He adjusted the map overlay again, eyes tracking the faint pulse of the helicopter icon as it battled the mountain's breath. This wasn't procedure anymore. It was hope improvising under pressure. Somewhere above that valley, a cub clung to an impossible ledge, and the signal blinking on his monitor was the only connection between life and disappearance. He didn't think about statistics or survival odds. The wilderness didn't care about numbers. It cared about balance, about the rare moments when it allowed mercy to exist. Tonight, Evan was betting on one of them. The rope fell from the helicopter like a lifeline made of shadow, swaying in the wind's argument. Snow whipped around it, turning the air into a storm of knives. From above, a small figure began to descend, a rescuer swallowed by white, lowering inch by inch through the blur of ice and altitude. Rusty froze where he clung, eyes reflecting the searchlight's fractured glow. The mountain growled beneath them, stones cracking under layers of stress. The rope jerked violently as gusts shifted direction, turning gravity into a weapon. The figure steadied, boots scraping the cliff wall for balance. The cub's world filled with noise, rotor thunder, rope strain, his own heartbeat hammering against bone. The wind carried no scent, no sense of what was coming next. For a brief moment, the rescuer hovered just above the ledge, close enough to reach, far enough for danger to still have a say.
The mountain answered back. A sound like a gunshot tore through the storm, the sharp report of stone splitting under weight and weather. The ledge shuddered, its frozen crust fracturing into veins of darkness. Snow burst upward in a white bloom as the foundation beneath Rusty began to crumble. The rescuer shouted something, lost instantly to the wind's roar, while the helicopter pitched sideways, fighting gravity's sudden appetite. For a breathless instant, time folded, rope, cub, and cliff suspended in one impossible frame. Then everything gave way. Rock, ice, and small body fell together, swallowed by the storm's throat. The rope snapped tight, yanking hard enough to steal breath. Pain rippled through the rescuer's shoulders, through the machine's cable, through the very spine of the mountain. It was no longer a rescue. It was a tug of war between life and the indifferent physics of falling. For a moment that felt eternal, falling became the only truth. Rusty's world inverted, sky below, earth above, gravity rewriting its laws. Wind howled past his ears, cold and sharp, stripping sound from thought. The rope caught him mid-descent, a sudden violence that bent motion into survival. His body swung in a frozen arc, colliding with the rescuer's chest. Together they dangled in the void, two fragile weights on the end of a trembling line. The helicopter strained against the pull, engines howling, rotors clawing air for stability. Ice chipped from the cliff face, raining down like glass. Rusty pressed against warmth for the first time in days, instinct overriding fear. The rescuer gripped him tight, cradling a heartbeat that still hadn't decided whether to continue. Above them, the mountain's edge seemed closer and farther at once. Below, silence waited, patient and absolute.
They rose slowly, the rope winding upward through snow that refused to stop falling. The helicopter hovered like an exhausted bird, engines screaming against the wind's will. Inside the open doorway, light spilled outward, a thin, trembling invitation. The rescuer hauled himself in first, then lifted the small shape bundled in his arms. Rusty's fur was stiff with frost, his body limp, breath faint. The warmth of the cabin hit him like shock. Hands moved quickly, layering blankets, pressing life back into him. The smell of fuel and metal filled the confined air. Outside, the mountain kept its silence, unconcerned that it had surrendered something it meant to keep. The door slammed shut, sealing the noise inside. The helicopter veered away from the cliff, banking toward the valley. Beneath them, the ledge that had held a life for days now crumbled completely, disappearing into the storm's white throat. The helicopter vanished into distance, its echo fading between ridgelines. Snow closed in over the scars it left behind, filling tracks, smoothing the wound. The mountain stood unchanged, ancient, indifferent, remembering nothing. From above, it looked peaceful again, a sculpted ocean of stillness stretching toward the horizon. No one would ever know how close the ledge had come to swallowing a life whole. The wind moved on, whispering through crevices, gathering flakes and secrets. Somewhere deep beneath the ice, water continued to move, carving new paths through stone. The wilderness was already rewriting the scene, replacing struggle with symmetry. For every rescue completed, it demanded another test, another price. In the valley below, faint light flickered as the helicopter descended toward human hands and measured warmth. Up here, though, nothing had changed. The mountain exhaled quietly, as if amused that anyone had tried to defy it.
Inside the rescue base, warmth felt like a strange kind of noise. The hum of heaters filled the narrow hallways, blending with the faint beeping of monitors. Rusty lay on a padded table, wrapped in layers of blankets that smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay. His fur steamed, thawing under the slow pulse of electric lamps. Every breath came shallow, uncertain, as if his lungs needed to remember how to move air again. Avery Reynolds moved quietly around him, hands steady, eyes tracing every shiver for signs of collapse. She measured his temperature, adjusted the heating pads, and checked the tiny heart that fluttered beneath his ribs. The snow outside the window glowed blue with the last light of day, pressing against the glass like a living thing. Inside, time stretched thin and fragile. Life, so recently borrowed, hesitated on the edge of returning. Hours slipped by in the rhythm of machinery and vigilance. The room smelled of metal and straw, an odd harmony between technology and earth. Avery sat nearby, scribbling notes by hand. Her pen scratched softly against paper, a quiet counterpoint to the drone of the heater. Rusty's breathing deepened, still irregular but less shallow. His paws twitched as nerves woke beneath the layers of thawing skin. She replaced a spent heat pack, feeling the faint tremor of muscle against her gloved palm. In that small gesture was an entire conversation between endurance and exhaustion. The wind outside had died, leaving a vacuum of stillness so complete she could hear the cub's faint pulse through the stethoscope. It wasn't strong, not yet, but it was there, steady enough to challenge the silence. In the face of all the cold beyond these walls, that rhythm was rebellion itself.
Sometime after midnight, movement returned. Rusty's paw flexed, claws scraping lightly against the towel beneath him. His chest rose higher, a small, deliberate expansion that seemed to defy gravity. Avery leaned closer, watching the pulse along his throat quicken. The monitor responded with a faint, hesitant beep. It wasn't triumph, it was negotiation. Between life and surrender, the body argued its case, one breath at a time. Frost still clung to the tips of his fur, but beneath it, warmth was winning. The heater clicked and held its temperature. A faint plume of steam lifted from the blankets, catching the yellow light like smoke from a new beginning. Outside, the first snow of dawn began to fall again, coating the base in another layer of silence. The storm had returned, but now it sounded different, less like a threat, more like a reminder that survival has echoes. Fatigue traced the corners of Avery's eyes, but her movement stayed precise. Every motion was an act of quiet insistence. Inject, measure, record, repeat. Her gloves creaked when she tightened the wrap around Rusty's leg. Under the soft hiss of oxygen, the cub stirred, a faint tremor that pushed warmth deeper into his body. She adjusted the monitors, calibrating machines that measured what instinct already knew. The room was dim, except for a single desk lamp, its light cutting a circle over the bed like a spotlight on resilience. The snow outside softened the world's edges. Inside, everything sharpened. Pulse, temperature, purpose. She whispered nothing, not words, but energy. A kind of silent pact between caretaker and creature. If effort were a language, this was fluency. Outside, the wind rattled a loose vent, testing the structure. Inside, life answered with a heartbeat strong enough to be heard again.
Far beyond the base, the world remained frozen and vast. Night spread across the mountains in deep layers of blue, each ridge dissolving into the next. June moved through it, her shape cutting slow arcs through knee-high snow. The air tasted of distance and storm. She hadn't eaten in days, but hunger was a smaller ache compared to absence. Her nose worked tirelessly, drawing in fragments of scent the wind refused to surrender. Each drift told half a story, every hollow promised nothing. She climbed until the valley below disappeared into mist, her muscles trembling but relentless. Around her, the wilderness listened, trees groaned under ice, and the river whispered beneath its shell of frost. The mountain that had taken so much offered no apology, yet June kept moving, her shadow long under the cold moonlight, because something deep within her refused to believe in endings. The wind shifted, carrying sound farther than scent. June paused on a ridge where the sky met the earth in a blur of pale silver. She opened her jaws and released a low, rolling chuff that trembled through the frozen air. The sound moved down the valley, threading between trees and over drifts, echoing against the stone. It wasn't a cry, it was a declaration, an ancient code written in breath. No answer came. The silence returned, heavy and endless. Yet something changed in her eyes, a spark of recognition, faint but sure. She turned south, following instinct more than evidence, stepping into a storm that erased everything behind her. Each stride dug deep, snow exploding beneath her weight. Above her, the moon hid behind fast-moving clouds. Ahead, faint light flickered through the haze, distant, man-made, the color of fire and promise. Somewhere beyond that glow, something familiar waited.
By dawn, snow had filled the tracks she left behind. The mountains erased her progress as quickly as she made it, folding the landscape back into perfection. June pressed forward through waist-deep drifts, shoulders slick with frost, breath rising like smoke. Every few yards, she stopped to taste the air, testing it for fragments of the life she'd lost. Once, a shadow moved ahead of her, a memory more than a shape, and she charged, heart hammering, only to find nothing but wind. Fatigue dragged at her muscles, but movement kept her from freezing. She learned to rest while walking, to breathe between heartbeats. The wilderness neither helped nor hindered, it simply observed. Behind her, the valley glowed faintly as morning light diffused through the cloud. Ahead, a river cut a thin black vein through the snow, whispering beneath its crust of ice. She followed the sound. It was direction enough. At the base, dawn bled into the room through frosted windows. The light was thin but alive, glancing off metal instruments and the soft curve of blankets. Rusty stirred beneath them. His chest expanded, deeper this time, lungs finally claiming air without struggle. Steam lifted from his fur in steady wisps, fading into the warm air. Avery stood motionless for a moment, eyes fixed on the pulse monitor. The line climbed, steadied, then held. Relief came not as words, but as a slow exhale that misted in the cold air. She leaned closer, watching small details, the flick of an ear, the twitch of a paw, the faint tremor of returning muscle. The heaters hummed steadily, constant and patient. Outside, the storm had softened into snowfall. Each flake touched the glass and vanished instantly, like time itself surrendering. Inside, the fight for warmth had been won, at least for now.
Light filled the lab with the quiet glow of morning. Rusty's fur, once gray with frost, now shimmered faintly red under the lamps. Avery noted the change absently in her report. Reddish hue, coat improving. A small observation that would later define a story. The name fit without ceremony, drawn from color and circumstance, practical yet tender. In the stillness of the room, the cub's breathing grew stronger, steadier, almost rhythmic. Heat packs were replaced, sensors removed one by one. For the first time, his heartbeat could be felt without machines translating it. Avery stood back, arms folded, exhaustion softening into calm. She glanced once toward the snow-bright window where daylight had thinned the shadows. Outside, the storm had finally exhausted itself. Inside, beneath layers of linen and hope, something fierce had survived. The world had given him a second beginning, and it came painted in rust and light. Far away, the storm's last gust swept across the ridges, and June lifted her head as if answering a sound only she could hear. Somewhere between wind and memory, a pulse echoed faintly, a shared rhythm that ignored distance. She stopped at the river's edge, staring across the black ribbon of current. The water steamed in the morning chill, a thin mist curling upward. On the other side, the valley stretched toward human light. She couldn't know that beyond those walls, her cub had opened his eyes. Yet the timing aligned, the same second, the same breath. Inside the base, heaters hummed. Outside, the wilderness inhaled deeply, resetting itself. June lowered her head, scooping a mouthful of snow, and continued forward. The world around her brightened almost imperceptibly, the way dawn always does when something lost begins to return.
Summer arrived without ceremony. The snow retreated to the highest ridges, revealing valleys bruised green with thaw. Rivers once sealed in ice now raced through canyons, swollen and loud, carrying the memory of winter in their cold. The same valley that had nearly buried life beneath it now pulsed with renewal. June's coat had grown darker, sleek with oil from fresh fish. Rusty trailed her along the riverbank, heavier, clumsier, but alive. Each movement he made carved confidence into the air. The wilderness looked unchanged, yet everything in it had shifted. The trees taller, the ground softer, the silence more forgiving. Overhead, clouds drifted in long, slow herds across a washed-out blue sky. The valley was breathing again, a rhythm of warmth and risk. For the first time in months, the mountain didn't look like an enemy. It looked like something earned. They moved together as if they had never been apart. June's stride remained sure and patient, while Rusty's was filled with restless energy, a rhythm caught between play and dependence. The air carried the smell of thawed soil and new growth. When she paused to drink from the current, he mirrored her, dipping his muzzle into the icy water.
The river ran quick and silver, catching sunlight and throwing it across their coats in moving patterns. Between them passed a silence deeper than sound, a connection stitched from survival and recognition. The months of separation were erased with one shared glance. The wilderness, impartial witness to everything, seemed to lean closer, taking inventory of this reunion it had nearly denied. In that quiet, the earth itself exhaled, as if granting permission to start over. Two survivors now existed where there should have been none.
The river had changed character. Its surface glittered with serenity, but its core moved with dangerous speed. Rusty, drawn by curiosity, ventured closer, paws testing the edge of a slick stone. The current whispered in strange rhythms, enticing him with light reflected off its surface. June watched from the bank, instincts tightening beneath calm observation. He leaned farther, chasing the illusion of motion beneath the surface. Fish darted in flashes of silver and shadow. The river murmured louder, its song shifting from invitation to dare. Rusty's reflection rippled, splitting into fragments of red and brown fur. For a heartbeat, he was suspended between safety and wonder. The wilderness has always known how to disguise its tests as beauty. The cub's weight shifted, claws slipping on wet rock. The world tilted slightly, water suddenly louder, and the thin line between curiosity and consequence disappeared beneath him. It happened with the sound of air leaving the world, a small splash swallowed by thunderous water. Rusty vanished into the current. The surface closed instantly, his shape dissolving into the churn. June lunged forward, claws gouging earth as she drove herself into the river. Cold gripped her muscles, turning strength into shock. The current seized her, spun her sideways, dragged at her fur. She fought to find footing, her paws striking stone beneath the surface. The water was alive, pulling with purpose, trying to carry her cub toward deeper channels. Every instinct screamed to reach, to grab, to hold. Spray blinded her, the roar of water erasing everything but motion. Above, sunlight shattered into 1,000 sharp mirrors. For a terrifying second, she saw nothing, no movement, no cub, just white water and the echo of her own heartbeat hammering inside the storm. The current didn't wait for her to think. June plunged deeper, eyes open to the blur of bubbles and debris. The river twisted around her, its strength ancient and unrelenting. Somewhere ahead, a flash of reddish fur appeared, tumbling through the current like driftwood. She kicked forward, jaws clenched against the cold. Her claws scraped the rocky bottom, pushing her upward and forward in violent bursts. Each stroke cost her breath, each moment spent underwater pulled light farther away. Rusty's body rolled once, twice, caught in the eddy's cruel circle. With a final surge, she broke through the turbulence and clamped her jaws around the scruff of his neck. His small weight jolted against her chest. Kicking hard, she turned toward shore, the current clawing at her sides. Behind them, the river raged on, indifferent to the fragile miracle that had just stolen something back from its depths. The river didn't surrender its claim. It pulled at June with all the force of melting mountains, twisting her in slow, violent circles. The water roared in her ears, dull and constant, erasing everything but motion. Rusty hung limply from her jaws, his body trailing in the current like a shadow. She dug for footing, claws scraping smooth rock beneath layers of silt. Her muscles screamed against the current's insistence. The world above blurred, sky and trees flickering between breaths. Water filled her nose and eyes, a cold fire burning through her lungs. For one heartbeat she faltered, feeling the drag of exhaustion, but instinct rose louder. She kicked again, hauling herself forward inch by inch. The current fought, furious and alive. She was not faster, only more stubborn.
When her paw finally touched gravel, she pushed toward it, dragging herself and her cub through the collapsing weight of the river.
Each second carried a sound, the thud of water against her ribs, the rasp of breath forced through her chest. June's mind flattened into rhythm. Pull, lift, breathe, hold. The river's roar blurred into a deep hum, a pulse that could have been her own heartbeat magnified by water. Rusty's small body pressed against her throat, his fur slick and heavy. She felt nothing beyond motion, no fear, no thought, only the narrowing tunnel between now and failure. Then, as the current eased, time began to return. The water slowed its argument, letting her move freely again. Beneath her, stones shifted like bones. She broke the surface with a gasp that cut the silence wide open. For a long moment she simply stood there, the river streaming off her body, steam rising from fur against sunlight. The wilderness paused, listening. Survival had sounded exactly like this. The current weakened its grip, giving her permission she didn't need. June pushed toward the bank, dragging Rusty higher until gravel replaced silt under her paws. The river resisted once, then let go entirely. Water poured from her coat in long sheets, pooling around her feet. She lowered Rusty gently onto the stones, nudging his small form with her muzzle. His eyes fluttered. A cough shook through him, thin but alive. The air filled with the soft hiss of retreating waves, their fury spent. June stood over him, body heaving, steam rising from her fur where sunlight touched it. The forest around them held its breath. In the branches above, snowmelt dripped like a clock ticking toward calm. The river behind them shimmered, pretending innocence again. Its voice had softened from roar to whisper. What moments ago had threatened to erase them, now murmured gratitude instead.
On the opposite bank, movement stirred. A deer emerged from the thicket, slender and deliberate, stepping onto the open stones. Its coat caught the light in muted gold, ears pivoting toward the noise that had just broken and healed the river. It stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the two bears. Between predator and prey stretched a fragile truce written by exhaustion. The deer did not flee, the bears did not chase. Steam rose from the river, drifting between them like smoke from an unseen fire. For a few seconds, the entire valley existed in equilibrium, every creature aware of every other heartbeat. Then the deer turned, slow and quiet, and slipped back into the trees. Its departure felt like punctuation, marking the end of danger and the beginning of something fragile. Even the water seemed to hush, carrying only the sound of breathing across its surface. Peace came disguised as soundlessness. The wind settled, brushing gently through wet fur. June lowered herself beside Rusty, curling her massive body to shield him from the chill that followed rescue. Rusty's breathing steadied. His paws twitched in dreamlike reflex. The world had rearranged itself. Nothing chasing, nothing fleeing, just pulse and air. Birds were absent, perhaps watching from safer distances. The river spoke quietly to itself, whispering of all it had taken and all it had returned. June's eyes stayed open, scanning the tree line, but her heartbeat slowed. She didn't trust peace, but she allowed it. The valley smelled of damp earth and renewal. In the fading light, every scar, every drop of water, every tremor seemed to declare the same truth, for now the wilderness had chosen mercy.
By late summer, the valley had changed again. The trees along the river had grown a dense crown of green, their reflections trembling on water clear enough to see the stones beneath. Evan Cole stood at the edge of this reborn place, boots sunk into soft mud. He had watched fire consume it, watched snow bury it, and now saw it breathe again. He carried no camera, only a small field notebook. Each page held coordinates, notes on vegetation, a few lines about bears. It wasn't data he cared about, it was continuity. He closed the book, eyes following a dark movement in the distance, June and Rusty along the opposite bank. The sight settled something inside him. Later that week, in the small ranger station under a flickering bulb, he wrote a single sentence in his report. Recommend protection status, habitat self-restoring, no human interference required. The work began quietly. Posts cut from fallen timber were set deep into the soil, stretching along the outer edges of the valley. No wire, no barbs, just boundary markers, a way to warn people rather than restrain animals. Signs were painted by hand, sanctuary zone, no entry. The crew worked in silence, aware they were building something closer to a promise than a structure. Evan oversaw each section, measuring distance between posts, ensuring sight lines stayed open. He wanted the valley visible, not hidden. By dusk, the fence traced the contour of the river like a signature across the land. From the air, it would look like punctuation at the end of chaos. Inside its circle, the wild would decide its own stories. When the last post was set, the workers left without ceremony, and the valley accepted the gift the only way it knew, by growing quiet again.
From the shadow of the tree line, June watched the humans leave. She could smell the sharp tang of fresh-cut wood and the faint oil of tools. The posts glowed pale in the afternoon light, marking edges that had never before existed. She moved closer, testing the air. Nothing in it spoke of threat. Rusty followed, nose low to the ground, tracing the new scent trail. The fence was simple, low, a line that stopped nothing. June paused beside one post, breathing deep, the smell of sap and soil mingling in her lungs. The wind carried Evan's fading scent, distant but familiar. She turned her head toward the river, the place that had tested them and then forgiven them. This human-made boundary didn't feel like confinement. It felt like recognition. She sat for a while, the sunlight warming her damp fur, and the valley finally felt hers again. The cub had grown taller, his shoulders broader, the awkwardness of youth fading into balance. He spent hours near the water, pushing stones with his paws, watching them roll and sink. Each motion was a rehearsal for independence, a study in gravity and consequence. June stayed nearby, but no longer hovered. Her eyes followed, patient and detached. Rusty ventured farther each day, exploring the bend where the current slowed, where minnows darted between light and shadow. His movements carried new confidence, though sometimes he still turned to check her presence. The valley itself had softened. Grass covered the scars left by fire, flowers pushed through ash, and air filled with the scent of wet soil and pine. For the first time, survival wasn't an emergency, it was routine, a daily practice of existing without fear. The wilderness had shifted from battlefield to home.
Months after the rescue, Avery Reynolds drove the narrow dirt road leading back into the valley. Her work rarely allowed return visits, but this place had lingered in her mind. The fence appeared first, a quiet outline of purpose. Inside it, life moved unhurried. She parked at the boundary and walked the rest of the way, carrying nothing but a camera and a field kit she didn't plan to use. From across the river, she saw them. 2 bears, one full-grown, one nearly so, feeding along the stones. Their coats gleamed with health, their movement fluid and sure. She noted their posture, breathing rate, muscle tone, everything she once measured by necessity now observed as gratitude. The cub she'd once called Rusty no longer looked fragile. She lowered the camera, realizing documentation was unnecessary. Sometimes, proof existed only in the quiet act of witnessing what had survived. Dusk lowered itself gently over the sanctuary. Between the trunks, pale shapes moved, ghosts made of quiet and grace. A small herd of deer stepped cautiously into the clearing, their hooves sinking into the damp soil along the river's bend. The air shimmered with golden dust from low sunlight filtering through spruce. June lifted her head but didn't rise. Rusty paused mid-step, watching as the animals bent to drink. For a brief moment, every creature in the valley shared the same rhythm. Breath, pause, sip. The deer's ears flicked toward the bears, but fear didn't follow. It was as if the valley itself had rewritten its rules. Predators and prey, once separated by necessity, existed here as evidence that balance could be rebuilt. When the wind shifted, the herd moved on, their silhouettes fading into trees, leaving behind only tracks that the river began erasing immediately.
For the first time since the mountain, June slept without vigilance. She lay stretched along a patch of sun-warmed ground near the river's edge, her breathing slow, deep, certain. Rusty curled at her side, his head resting on her flank, the rhythm of her heartbeat syncing with his. The air buzzed softly with late summer insects, their hum steady but distant. Above them, the canopy swayed, spilling broken light across their fur. The river murmured, calmer now, reduced to a whispering rhythm that sounded almost like reassurance. Nothing hunted, nothing fled. It was the kind of quiet the wild grants only to those who have already paid for it. As day tilted toward evening, the shadows lengthened, covering the clearing in gold and gray. The valley itself seemed to settle with them, its pulse easing, its edges finally soft again. Even after the reports were filed and the fence declared complete, Evan kept returning. He parked near the same stump each week, notebook in hand, though he rarely wrote anymore. The sanctuary had become a mirror for silence, a place where observation outgrew language. Through binoculars, he watched June and Rusty move like constellations across the valley floor, predictable in their routes, unpredictable in everything else. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, he caught their scent. Earth, musk, pine resin. It reminded him how thin the line was between wilderness and witness. He didn't cross the boundary, not once. He simply sat, the weight of civilization left behind in the truck, listening to the slow grammar of water and leaf. In their survival, he found a kind of instruction, a lesson that stewardship can be measured not by presence, but by restraint. By early autumn, the valley had become a story shared far beyond its borders. Visitors who never saw it sent letters instead. Drawings, poems, folded notes written in careful hands. Some arrived at the ranger station, addressed to the bears. Evan collected them in a glass jar, carrying it each time he visited the fence. He left it beneath a cedar tree inside the boundary, among roots damp with morning rain. The wind toyed with the papers, lifting edges, reading fragments aloud before tucking them back. Words of hope and apology mingled inside. "You made me believe in something good again. I hope the cub runs free." When he returned weeks later, the jar was gone. Maybe it rolled into the river. Maybe the weather took it. He didn't search for it. Some stories don't need safekeeping. They just need to be told once. Autumn wind swept through the valley like a closing gesture, scattering leaves across the open fields. They spun in spirals above the water before settling onto its surface and drifting downstream. The world was quieter now, migration already underway, skies emptying of noise. June and Rusty stood together near the far bank, watching the current carry the season's remnants away. The air smelled of pine resin and distant snow, the first hint of winter returning. Evan sat at the boundary, unseen but present, his breath clouding in the chill. Across the water,
The bears lifted their heads briefly toward the movement of air, then turned back to the river. It wasn't acknowledgement exactly, more a shared understanding between all things that endure. The wind continued north, taking with it ash, pollen, and stories no longer needed to be spoken aloud.
By midsummer, the air changed again. The lush green of spring dulled into a brittle yellow, and the river shrank to a thread of light through cracked stones. Pine needles fell early, carpeting the ground in rust-colored whispers. June sensed it before Evan's instruments did, the imbalance, the shift. Each breath she drew carried a faint metallic edge, the smell of heat and distance. Rusty, nearly grown now, wandered further each day, unbothered by the stillness that unnerved the rest of the valley. The wilderness felt tense, waiting for something it already knew was coming. The sky burned pale, the horizon hazed with dust. Even the birds were quieter, their songs shortened into warnings. By the time the first lightning strike hit far beyond the ridge, the valley was already ready to burn. Nature always lights its matches long before the spark arrives. It began as light without sound, an immense silent flash that tore the horizon open. Seconds later, thunder rolled down the ridges like a slow avalanche. Then came smoke. Thin at first, a whisper against the skyline, rising from the dry tangle of spruce and dead grass. The wind caught it, folded it, spread it. Within an hour, the valley's edge smoldered, the glow faint but growing. From the sanctuary floor, June lifted her head, nostrils flaring. The scent was unmistakable, burning resin, pine sap bursting under heat. She turned toward the ridgeline, scanning the hills. Rusty appeared beside her, curious but unafraid. The air shimmered, a faint orange reflection dancing in his eyes. The wilderness had written this scene before. Fire is its punctuation mark, its way of remembering what came before. In that moment, balance tipped again. The valley that healed now waited to be tested.
The first animals moved before the fire was visible. Deer broke from the trees, running in low arcs through the grass, their hooves muffled by ash-soft soil. Birds wheeled overhead, black silhouettes against the paling sky. The smell reached the river like a warning carried by ghosts. June stood tall, ears pinned, muscles tense. Rusty watched, confused by the sudden absence of pattern. The air thickened, turning sunlight into copper haze. When the fire appeared on the ridge, it wasn't a line, it was a wall, rippling and alive. Heat moved faster than flame, pushing through the valley in invisible waves. June nudged her son toward the water, instincts awake and absolute. The forest crackled behind them, each tree breaking like bone. Smoke rolled low across the ground, swallowing scent and sound. Every creature that could move was already moving. The valley itself began to run. By the time they reached the river, the world behind them was unrecognizable. Flame chased the horizon, curling upward in columns that twisted and merged into one vast storm of fire. The noise was endless, a living thunder that replaced thought. Heat struck from every direction, driving the air from their lungs. June stepped into the shallows, the water near boiling, and turned to face what was coming. Rusty pressed against her side, trembling. Ash rained down in thick black flakes, clinging to their wet coats. The fireline advanced unevenly, leaping gaps, devouring green. Trees exploded as sap ignited, their trunks bursting like flares. June held position, every instinct screaming to flee, yet she stayed, a wall between her cub and the oncoming blaze. Above them, the sky cracked open with wind and light. Survival, once learned, demanded to be proven again.
When the fire reached the bank, the heat became unbearable. The air itself seemed to burn, tasting of metal and salt.
June pushed deeper into the river, the current wrapping around her legs like cold cloth. Rusty followed, half swimming, half stumbling. Steam rose in great curtains as flame met water. Across the valley, a helicopter dipped low, spraying white foam that vanished before touching the ground. From behind the fence, Evan watched through stinging eyes, powerless to intervene. The bears stood midstream, surrounded by smoke and orange light, the river their only refuge. June kept her head above the surface, her gaze fixed forward, unblinking. The fire advanced, paused at the edge of the water, then climbed away, frustrated, seeking other fuel. When the wind finally shifted, the noise broke apart. Silence returned, carrying with it the scent of rain that always follows ruin. When morning came, the valley was unrecognizable. The forest stood as a black cathedral of charred trunks, their shadows stretching thin across the ashen ground. The river ran low and gray, its surface flecked with floating embers, yet still moving, always moving. June and Rusty climbed from the shallows onto what had once been grass. Their fur was streaked with soot, the pads of their paws left dark prints across the cooling soil. Above them, the air shimmered with a quiet that wasn't peace, only aftermath. Evan watched from the ridge, the smoke curling around him in fading ribbons. The wilderness had rewritten itself again, stripping everything to its rawest form. It wasn't destruction, it was reset. The fire had taken much, but not purpose. June lifted her head, sniffing the changed wind. Even in ruin, the valley still breathed, waiting for green to remember its way back.
Weeks passed, marked not by time but by color returning. First came moss, clinging to blackened stones in defiance of memory. Then shoots of grass threaded through ash, pale and fragile. The river regained its shine, carrying seeds from unburned slopes. Rain fell often, softening the soil, rinsing away the scent of smoke. June moved slower now, her fur beginning to grow back, thick and clean. Rusty followed close, his curiosity rekindled. Deer returned first, stepping lightly over the new growth, their reflections steady in the shallows. Birds came next, their calls uncertain, as if testing the valley's forgiveness. The wilderness proved resilient. In silence and patience, it repaired itself, one root at a time. And through that slow resurrection, the bears continued to roam, silent witnesses to a promise the earth keeps only with those who endure long enough to see it kept. Another season turned, and Rusty's frame lengthened into power. The awkwardness of cubhood dissolved into the certainty of adulthood. His coat, once patchy with recovery, now shone with deep russet hues that caught the light like copper in motion. He moved differently, deliberate, measured, his steps no longer echoing June's but complementing them. Together, they patrolled the valley's edges, marking stones, testing trails, feeding where life had returned richest. The sanctuary thrived again, though scarred. Fireweed bloomed in bright bands along the hillsides, painting beauty over memory. Evan watched less often. He no longer needed to measure what he trusted. Rusty learned where the fish hid in late summer pools and how to stand tall to catch scent on shifting air. He was becoming what the wilderness needed next, a symbol of its persistence, a continuation written in muscle, movement, and quiet purpose.
When the first snow fell again, Rusty was ready. He stood near the outer edge of the sanctuary, where the fence traced its pale line against the forest. Beyond it lay miles of untouched wilderness, the kind that doesn't forgive or remember. June remained behind, older now, her breath slower but steady. Rusty turned once toward her, then toward the figure on the ridge, Evan, still keeping distance, still present. For a long heartbeat, everything aligned. Bear, man, and land suspended in mutual understanding. Then Rusty moved forward, crossing shallow snow without hesitation. His form blended into the trees, a flicker of red fading into gray. The fence meant nothing to him. It never had. The wilderness accepted his return without fanfare. In that quiet departure, there was no ending, only continuation. The story's weight carried forward in silence and paw prints. Winter returned soft and soundless. The valley slept beneath its quilt of frost, the river murmuring faintly beneath thin ice. June rested in her den, the rhythm of her breathing steady, echoing through the cold earth. Somewhere beyond, Rusty roamed under a rising moon, his path cutting fresh patterns through snow untouched by humans. The wilderness had survived again, reshaping itself around loss and renewal. It didn't commemorate, it continued. Wind traced through the blackened trees, carrying no words, only memory. Down in the valley, the fence stood silver in moonlight, an outline of respect, not control. Evan's reports were finished, his visits fewer, yet the story lingered in every rustle of pine and every ripple of the river. The wild had spoken in fire, in ice, in silence, and it would go on speaking long after anyone stopped listening, keeping its own perfect record.